Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike Coffin. I'm the head of oil, gas and mining at the Carbon Tracker Initiative. And for this session coming up, we've got a session on energy security, creating a more resilient global energy system. First, let me introduce the panelists. So we have first on my left, Esin Serin, Policy Fellow, the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change. Next, we have Rachel Fletcher, Director for Regulation at Octopus Energy. Then finally, we have Stephen Hill, who's the Global Co-Head of Energy at Eversheds Sutherland. So, without further ado, let's kick off with the first question for the panelists. First up, so what does energy security mean to each of you? I think first it's really important, actually, we kind of understand what we're talking about here as a topic. So perhaps we can start with Stephen, with yourself. What does energy security mean to you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invite. So when I think about energy security, I tend to think along the classic energy trilemma. And by that I mean energy security, energy cost, and energy sustainability. And those three things interact with each other. And they tend to fluctuate in importance over a period of time. And actually, if I look back sort of 2 years ago, maybe energy security wasn't the most important of those three. And actually, we're in a conference about the countdown to COP, and energy sustainability was a much more important part of that. But increasingly, with the cost of living and then the Ukrainian war and the impact of that, energy security has really come to the fore for that energy trilemma. And therefore, what do I think about that? I see that as being that sort of short term. If we're always trying to chase the next part of that triangle, how do we deal with that? And I think to me, therefore, energy security is much more about how do we create a long-term sustainable framework in which energy can be delivered to the end consumer, be it industrials or actually individuals. And trying to create the environment for that is really important. And I don't think we've given enough long-term thought to that. And I think we need much more around planning. We need much more around leadership. I think actually we need a lot more around collaboration as well, and that's collaboration amongst industrials, but also amongst nations. This is a global situation that we're in, and we can't just look at individual nation states. And I think if we get those three elements together, then that will really help that long-term sustainable solution. And that's what I see as energy security, as well as keeping the lights on over a dark winter.
Cool. Okay. And then Rachel, coming to you next on that. What does energy security mean to you?
I mean, I'd agree with a lot of what Stephen said. I mean, I think it's knowing that you've got enough energy to meet your demand and against a range of what might be quite concerning scenarios, right? So if you look at what happened as we went into last winter, yes, the lights were on, but how confident were we that we had enough energy to see us through the whole winter? There definitely were some big question marks about that. So I think there's a temporal aspect to this. We've got to be confident enough in the short term, beyond today and tomorrow, particularly over a winter. And we've got to have confidence in the medium to long term so that we can grow our economy, look after citizens of Britain. I mean, we'll come on to talk about this a bit more, I'm sure. But I mean, traditionally, energy security has really all been about a small number of very, very big power stations, and whether they were at risk of going off because they were in disrepair. And actually, where we are increasingly with a renewable system is we've got a much more diversified set of generators, diversified geographically, but also diversified in terms of technology, but also playing a vital and increasing role in that keeping the system in balance is actually what will end up being millions of assets across the country, including some of which are going to be in your home.
Great. And finally, Esin, is there anything to add on energy security and what that means to you?
Yeah, I would echo what's already been said, but I was going to pick up on your word diversity. To me, it means diversity, and that's diversity of the sources of energy, fuels and generation, as well as the tools we can draw on to manage demand in a smart way. Because if we build that diversity in, then we aren't relying on any one tool or any one country more than we should. We can have some renewables, a lot of renewables. We can have some nuclear. We can have some gas generation coupled with carbon capture. And then on the other side, we would have demand-side management. We would have large-scale energy storage, but also a massive fleet of electric vehicles, which we can also essentially use as this large-scale battery for the grid. And then a potential disruption to any one of these tools can be compensated by the other things relatively smoothly, giving us that secure, reliable energy we need.
Great. So I think we've talked a little bit there, or clearly touched on, primarily from a supply side, so looking at availability, affordability, and resilience of the supply infrastructure. But clearly, you talked there, Rachel, about balance. And for me, clearly, it's a supply-demand balance. So moving to the demand side, and maybe some thoughts on that. Rachel, do you have any thoughts on demand-side actions and what role actually that can play, and maybe some reflections in there about some of the demand sides we've seen over the last 18 months or so?
Yeah, I mean, as I started to talk about this, I mean, I think that, traditionally we thought about keeping the lights on, keeping the system in balance as being about flexing fossil fuel generators. And gas-fired generation, for example, is a highly flexible form of generation. So the system operator could be looking at a couple of hours, see a demand spike for whatever reason, and quite quickly get a response from one or two large gas-fired power stations. Effectively, I think where we need to go as a country is to turn that whole equation upside down. Because actually, if you think about it, our renewable energy system is not flexible. Sadly, we have not yet learned how to control the sun or the wind, and maybe that will happen in my lifetime, I don't know. But what we have learned to do, actually, is how to control demand. So, over the next 10 to 15 years, we think that demand is going to grow hugely, possibly close to doubling where it was a couple of years ago. About 50% of that increase in demand is going to come from highly controllable sources like electric vehicle batteries and heat pumps. And what that does is it provides a fantastic counterbalance. It's a sort of yin and yang alongside renewable power, where we can actually flex when we're charging electric vehicles, when we're priming heat pumps, so that we're making use of green electrons when they're plentiful, which also, for any economist in the room, will know is when they're cheap. We can also, by doing that, we can avoid massive increases in peak demand, which is what drives the need for investment in networks and in generation. So not only can we use this demand side to keep the lights on, we can use it to get to net zero much more cheaply, with estimates around about 15 to 17 billion pounds of saving a year, if we can get this right over the next couple of decades. Now, quite often when we talk about this, people's eyes glaze over and it feels a little bit tomorrow's worldy. And you asked the question about the last 18 months, and some of you might be aware that as we went into last winter, the system operator saw the need for contingency to help keep the lights on. They contracted with coal-fired power stations, so we kept a whole load of very high-emitting coal-fired power station on the grid. But in a stroke of genius and innovation, they also contracted for demand-side response, and by which I mean people like you and me. So you may or may not have participated in this, but effectively at the day-ahead stage, we were given information about when we needed customers to avoid using electricity. And through a simple email or text message, communication went out. And lo and behold, what we found over the course of the winter, about 1.5 million customers participated in this, making small changes in their daily schedule, shifting when they cooked their dinner or when they put the tumble dryer on. And that made a phenomenal difference to the task of the system operator of keeping the lights on managed. Octopus Energy customers alone managed to shift the equivalent every hour of about half of London's demand. So it's a kind of a magical hidden resource that we've got. So in this world where we're quite often talking about cost and prices going up and the difficulties of getting to net zero, there's some actually really good news, I think, and some really good signs. And that's a very low-tech way, by the way, of harnessing consumer demand, but some really positive signs there on how you can do these things at scale.
So great. So I think there's some good lessons there from an individual consumer perspective as well, but thinking slightly more broadly onto a sort of corporate level as well, in terms of other lessons that we can learn over the last 18 months. So Stephen, coming to you next, can you think sort of what lessons do you feel that you've learned or have come through in your business from that, particularly from a corporate perspective?
Yeah, well, I sort of feel that every time I ask this question, I look back over the last 18 months, there's always been challenges, and I think this has just got even worse. But I would just echo something that Rachel said. I think the demand side has been, will increase almost exponentially, and it will be a real issue. And if you think that electrifying for electric vehicles is difficult, wait till we try to electrify heat. That's going to be a big challenge, and by heat I'd also mean cooling in other jurisdictions. From a corporate perspective, and particularly looking at the supply side, so what has changed over the last 18 months? Well, I think there's been a growth. The challenges first, some of the challenges around that I think are around the decentralizing of power, and I think the increasing focus on that I think is really important. We have but also lots of other jurisdictions have an incomplete and not fit for purpose grid infrastructure for what we are looking to do. And if we're looking to move green electrons around the grid, at the moment we aren't able to work with that, both in the UK, but also in Germany and in some of the developing countries as well. There are big challenges around that, and the investment required for that is significant. It's billions of pounds that will need to be invested in order to make the grid infrastructure work for the type of intermittent and other power that's going to come and need to come onto the market. And if I look further afield, I look at some of the, if I look at America, America's come up with the IRA, which is a really, to some extent, quite a simplified solution to investment for corporates. And the amount of investment that's going in there, I think, will be significant. They're purportedly $369 billion worth of investment. And actually, if I look across at the EU, there's just a myriad of talk but no real action around that. And I think if we in Europe are going to try step up to that, we need to come up with a solution that encourages the investment in there. At the moment, the US might be very protectionist on that, but we need to have a similar system over here. And the way we're structured, allowing member states to do it, I think does need to be addressed. Otherwise, we'll miss out on that opportunity. So I look at lack of infrastructure and the challenges around investment and money moving to the US as a result of the IRA. And one final challenge, there's been lots of talks earlier today from pension funds who are looking to invest. And their responsibility is to invest sustainably for their members and ultimately in order to match their pension liabilities that they put in. And if you look at the way inflation and therefore interest rates have gone up, actually, the distinction between investing in a power plant, be it a wind farm or a solar plant or something similar to that, compared to the investment they can get from gilts, actually that delta has come down quite significantly now. And that makes it more challenging for these people who need to make sure that they are taking a risk-assessed basis of their investment to think about those. Having said that, there are some really positive things around that. What we've seen as a firm is a huge increase in green PPAs. So that's power purchase agreements where large industrials, particularly those in the chemicals or cement or steel industries, are looking to get that power directly from green generators. Those things are increasing, and actually the types of major corporates that we're acting for are looking to do that across their whole value chain. So that's a really important piece and a real growth story around that. And then we're also seeing newer technologies come to the fore. So we've been talking about hydrogen for a lot, and actually we're seeing those investments being made. And hydrogen will be one of the solutions that comes to help us over the next 5, 10, 15 years in order to mitigate some of the issues here.
Great. And so you touched there on a few of you touched a little bit there on the technologies, but I think sort of that leads you on very nicely to the next question. Before we talk about some of the barriers for implementation, which I think it's really important to look at what each of you think are some of those key enabling technologies. So Stephen, you just touched there on hydrogen, but Esin, what do you think are some of the key enabling technologies we need to create a more secure energy system, both in the UK, but also more, abroad and more globally as well?
I guess renewables is the most simple answer, obvious answer there. We need to scale up renewables really rapidly over this decade and through the 2050s. Nuclear will have a role in terms of that baseload power. Hydrogen is going to be important, especially for storage purposes and to provide that resilience into seasonal storage. And it will also help to decarbonize these hardest to abate sectors for us. Carbon capture and storage, I want to come on to.
So maybe let's come on to carbon capture and storage in a moment. But Rachel, perhaps if we come on to you, any other enabling technologies? I mean, obviously we just talked about the supply side, but enabling technologies or even energy vectors as well as we go through. So.
Yeah, I think focusing on the electricity system in particular, I think it's less about technology. Because many, if not most of the technologies, albeit in nascent form, are there for us to run a fully renewable electricity system. I think what we need are the mechanisms to bring these technologies together and to optimize their use, to keep the lights on and to keep renewable power cheap. And I think would actually be my response to the IRA. What I would say to Rishi Sunak or Jeremy Hunt, were they in this room, is don't try and match the US on a money game. Try and outsmart them. And the way you outsmart them is by doing what no other country is doing as well as we are beginning to do in the UK, which is to really bring those renewable, low-carbon, flexible technologies, whether that's grid-scale storage, whether that's interconnection, whether that's demand-side management, and bring those to work in harmony with renewable power to deliver a secure and resilient grid.
Okay. And then you touched there on CCS. I think, again, a lot of people... frankly, I think there's a lot of confusion about what CCS is. Is it carbon capture storage? Is it carbon capture utilization? Is it enhanced oil recovery, which is clearly a big problem? So CCUS, carbon capture utilization and/or storage, encompasses a whole range of technologies. And I think those technologies, when deployed, from my perspective, have a really different impact on reducing emissions, and in some cases, probably a net negative. Particularly in the case of enhanced oil recovery. But thinking about CCS specifically applied to gas power in the UK, what role do you see that playing right now? Because there are certainly varying opinions out there in the role at CCS. So Esin, coming back to you there.
Yeah, a strategic role, I would say. In the UK, the UK's independent climate advisor, Climate Change Committee, has designed this balanced pathway for the UK to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. And that pathway actually involves a rapid scale of gas generation coupled with carbon capture. And that sees it actually meeting 6% of the UK's electricity demand by 2035. That's to do with providing dispatchable power to the grid to help manage the variability of renewable generation. And here, in this context, I believe everybody will be familiar. Dispatchable means power we can ramp up and down on demand. Energy storage will be a big part of that story, but given current costs of batteries and simply how much of it we would need if we were to rely solely on batteries for this purpose, there's a cost efficiency argument for developing some gas generation coupled with carbon capture for just a small number of plants in order to support the grid cope with this variability of renewable generation. But there are certain risks to this development, I would say. The first risk, and actually the challenge, is making sure CCUS is developed in a way that's actually consistent with net zero. because if we develop too much of it too quickly, that risks locking the UK into consumption of gas that could have been avoided. And that comes with the inherent risk of keeping the UK exposed to the volatility of international gas markets longer than necessary. And there's also technological risk. Scientists are confident that we can manage this risk reasonably well, but there will still be some learning to do by doing along the way. And the first set of plants may not work perfectly. That's not to suggest we can rule out CCS as a solution, because we simply can't afford to. That's both the UK's Climate Change Committee and IPCC modelling says we need this technology for various different emissions reduction purposes. But we need to be honest about the risk, and we need to make sure that our emissions reduction strategies aren't relying on CCS more than they should, especially where alternative technologies exist and might be better suited. And that's especially true in the context of renewables, and we know they are coming down in cost really rapidly. So it will play a strategic role, but it should not come at the expense of a massive push for renewables and clean energy sources as fast as practically possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that issue there of lock-in, so justifying gas expansion of fossil fuel supply and generation through appealing to CCS is, I think, a real challenge, and what that potentially does on lock-in. And I think you then touch there, for me, the piece that really resonates there is around the challenge of deploying this at scale and in the right time, but without over-reliance. And I think, so Stephen, I'll come to you in a second on this. For me, it's also around the element to which actually is power relatively easy to decarbonise. So if we just look at the decarbonisation section, and actually some of the CCS, if you've got limited capacity for that offshore, and as a geologist myself, thinking about limited geological storage sites and opportunity, perhaps should some of the CCS, it is necessary in those scenarios, but should it not be reserved for some of the hardest to abate sectors, whether that's heavy industry, things like cement, steel, obviously as electrifying steel processes is developed. So Stephen, if I'll just come briefly to you there on a comment on CCS, and particularly wasting, if you like, it on some of the easier to abate sectors.
I maybe can't talk quite on that, but so as a firm, we do a lot of energy transition work, which means for us we do a lot of renewable energy projects and act on those. But notwithstanding that, we do see gas as a transition fuel. So whereas we see coal being phased out, here we would see gas as transition, and therefore we see CCS as an abatement tool for that, and is therefore necessary over probably the short to medium term. But short to medium term is sort of 10 to 40 years, so long term in most people's lives, but not for the long-term future. And I know there are some challenges around it, but the technology for that has been around for a long time, 30, 40 years. So this isn't new technology that we need to invent. It's reasonably well known, but there are challenges around it. And I think the main challenges are around the cost. And how do we do that? So in the first round of CCS, it was point to point. That became very expensive. How do you deal with that? And therefore, we can see it having in large industrial areas. So if you take Teesside or whatever, lots of industrials going in. Actually, can you club together and collaborate together in order to make CCS work for a hub of industries as opposed to just one? And then the second area that we see still as a challenge is around the risk at the end. So once the project has been done and it's no longer any more CO2 being put in, who then takes that end responsibility? And ultimately that comes down to governments, which ultimately means it comes down to all of us. And will governments, not just in the UK, but globally where it's actually used, be able to do that? And when I think about CCS, I often use the bath analogy. We've got a bath that's being filled up with CO2, and we use CCS as the sort of overflow pipe. Well, that's fine, and it sort of works, but wouldn't it be better to slowly dial down the tap rather than just use the overflow pipe?
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can dial down the tap faster than just slowly. But yes, but in terms of some of the sort of thinking now about some of the barriers to actually the change, I think we've talked there about the technologies, and in fact, many would say the technologies are there, but it's about deploying them and implementing them at scale, and both at scale, and at pace. So actually, sticking with you, Stephen, there, in terms of the barriers, what do you see as some of the current key barriers to accelerating the transition from a fossil fuel-based energy system, both in the UK, but also, again, thinking more in terms of global energy system and the security there?
Yeah, so if I look at the type of work that we do, I'd see two main barriers. One is the regulatory environment. And forgive me, bring it back to the UK in the first instance, but the regulatory environment here is not as conducive to investment, particularly in renewable power, that we would like. There is still a long lead in time in order to get to the regimes that we want. The subsidy regime, or CFD, arguably price stabilisation regime, it seems to work quite well. That is bringing through the latest CFD round. Wasn't quite so successful with some wind projects, but ultimately seems to work. But what we then need, as well as the regulatory regime, is a governance and rule of law position that governments won't change their mind afterwards. And we've seen instances in Spain and in France, and one could even argue in the UK, given the announcement by Sunak a couple of weeks ago around EV, that actually you need an environment in which investments can be made by corporates and by financial institutions such that they can confidently build out and invest in the infrastructure that we need, both in terms of generation assets, but also in terms of the transmission assets as well. So we do a lot of work on interconnectors, and we see, which I think you mentioned as well, and that we see interconnectors as being a really important piece to deliver green electrons from one country to another country. You know, in Norway, huge amounts of hydropower. Why can't we bring that down to here in an efficient and effective manner? It's even fun coming from Morocco for solar power. But actually that type of investment environment and regulatory regime is really important. And that sort of long-term planning will be needed. And the types of thing we'll be going to COP28 on and asking the governments there is around how can you make sure that for all the countries we've got the investment that's available there in order for financial institutions and corporates to make that investment.
Great. And then slightly conscious of time, I want to make sure that we do come to the audience for questions in a moment. But then, Rachel, there, just thinking a bit more, Stephen mentioned there some of the regulatory barriers, but thinking more specifically at Octopus yourselves and some of those specific barriers. And I reflect, so my dad's we've had solar panels on the roof for probably about 10 years, but trying to install a heat pump has been really, really challenging, jumping through all the different hoops and the regulation, ultimately, we're being asked to install a heat pump that's far bigger and more expensive than, frankly, we need because of the regulatory environment. But actually, it's not about my dad's heat pump. What about Octopus? And what do you see as some of the regulation challenges? And what do you think are the key things that we can all do, ultimately, to help push for regulation that's fit for purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we need to realise that actually we're starting from a pretty good place in terms of the amount of investment that has been achieved through the market reforms that were put in place about a decade ago in this country. I'd probably feel more optimistic than some of the other comments that have been made. I mean, and I think, again, especially if you look at what has happened to the cost of wind and the cost of solar over the last 5 years, never mind 10 years, is absolutely astonishing. And yes, batteries are expensive right now, but we know that they're coming down very, very rapidly, not least because there's a now increasing international competition on batteries for electric vehicles. And some of that learning and competition is making its way into grid-scale batteries. We are actually one of the investors in the X-Links project, the very ambitious project bringing solar from Morocco, which acts as a kind of almost like a base load supply. It's incredibly reliable, the sunshine in Morocco, apparently. And so, personally, I feel optimistic that we might not have to use that overflow pipe, that we can actually get technology costs down. But I think the thing that is needed is actually better functioning markets. So yes, there's a role for planning, but actually the thing that we don't have enough of, I think, yet, is the price signals about where energy is green and where it's cheap and where people should be using it. We don't have enough of those locational signals. We don't have enough of those temporal signals. So we've got about 200,000 of our own customers on some kind of time of use smart tariff, shifting their energy or inviting us to shift when they charge their electric vehicle on a day-by-day basis. And that's having already taking off, helping people save money and making the best use of a renewable system. And I think actually what we need is more markets, more price signals, more competition to bring these products to market, and kind of to focus on that rather than subsidies and worrying about whether we're going to keep up with our neighbours across the pond.
Great. So I think, yeah, a really positive message there, particularly around the growth of new technology. And personally, I am too optimistic that the new technology and the new energy system, the costs are coming down, become increasingly more affordable, that the policy action to phase out fossil fuels will actually, they'll be outcommuted and the demand will be substituted. And it's maybe, hopefully, we don't need that CCS and it doesn't kind of make sense for continued oil and gas extraction. But to help support that technology rollout, clearly we do need critical minerals and other critical minerals and other resources to help develop those technologies. So just a final very brief question to Esin here around supply chains. Clearly there's been a lot of disruption over the last 18 months. What do you think that has done, and what do you think the knock-on effects over the next 2, 3, 5 years will be in terms of global supply chains around some of those critical minerals and resources needed for the new energy system?
Yeah, the new energy system, net zero, basically is a technological transformation, and it really is about how countries will get their hands on enough of these technologies to transition entire energy systems to become more secure and to become consistent with net zero. As you have pointed out, we have seen in the past 18 months disruptions to supply chains. China is currently a massive supplier of so many of these clean technologies, and it also dominates the mining and processing of so many of the critical minerals needed to produce these technologies. And yeah, that kind of over-reliance on a single source is simply not resilient or sustainable. And part of the answer to that will be building some domestic manufacturing capacity, but actually, probably more importantly, we'll need a lot more international collaboration on this to diversify our supply chains, to diversify our sources of access to these clean technologies. And that's the security part of things. That's what countries will need to think about from a security perspective. But there's also the opportunity, because countries who position themselves at the forefront of technological development and build capacity to produce these things competitively will actually be able to access enormous export opportunities from a market of a growing global market for these clean technologies. So yeah, both from a security and economic perspective, there's need for that proactive thinking about the supply chain strategy to deliver an energy transition. And as been pointed out, the US and the EU have made really important progress on this with the IRA and with the Green Deal Industrial Plan, respectively. But the UK's approach so far has been really slow. It's made it an outlier almost on this issue. So hopefully we will see more detail and clarity on that in the autumn statement, as been promised by the Chancellor.
Let's hope so. Thank you. So I think we'd now like to open the floor up to questions. I think there's a couple of mics going around, so please could you wait until that comes. So there's there in the grey jacket there.
Yes, hi, excellent. Just quickly, if you actually look at outside the square for other sources of energy, biomass is about 5 million tons of wheat chaff and all the wastage in agriculture. Poo, there's 55 million tons of poo. I'm not even counting the pee that you can collect from essentially straw bedding when the animals go out. You've got a whole series, and you've got a chance of getting anaerobic digesters, which we've already got a number, but we've got a massive opportunity to really take all that methane. And Texas has done really well, and others. There's other opportunities, 11 million tons of food waste. That with compost systems and worms, you can convert that into more energy, etc. And again, more anaerobic digesters. We've calculated it's about 10, 12, 14% of energy possible demand for UK. What do you think? You think this is really viable, or is it just too hard to collect it all and just is it too small, or can it be done at scale?
So briefly, do any of the panelists want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think we're seeing, we've certainly seen more investment in biomass and AD over the last couple of years than we have over the sort of previous 5 years before that. There was a bit of a hiatus for a period of time, but I think you're right. Some of the issues around it are the sort of feedstock issues, and you need to make sure that don't have concentration risk with one supplier there, so you need a diversity of there. We like the way that it's decentralized as well. We like the way it can be done both heat and power. We talk a lot about power in these conversations, but actually it's heat as well. So we do see a growth industry around that, and actually they are more we got solar's pretty straightforward, wind's reasonably straightforward nowadays. It's a more complicated structure, but it's not that difficult and is there. So actually the important thing for me is that I'm seeing financial institutions start to invest in that, and they see that as a long term. And when they invest, again, it's for pension funds who are looking at a long term yield from that in order to offset their liabilities. So definitely see that as a potential growth area.
Okay, so we've got one more question from the front here, please.
Yeah, just wanted to actually, we're talking about, of course, energy security, whether there is actually an effort to look at geothermal as a source of energy. And also, I think with regards to the barriers that you're talking about, I think one of the things that is a reality is that there is a huge legacy estate across the UK, and retrofitting it actually for either air source heat pump or whatever it is, that retrofitting cost is actually quite a challenge, particularly for domestic owners and even for us in the NHS. So it's getting, because there's no use of putting in an air source heat pump in a house that leaks. It's not actually airtight. So that's the other challenge, because you cannot just put a heat pump in your garden and connect it, but then it just goes everywhere because there's no room to put a lot of stock. Actually, there are houses that doesn't have the cavity to put insulations either in the roof or in the walls. So where does that go?
So briefly, Rachel, Esin, do you want to
Yeah,
comment on
I'll
that?
pick up on the heat pump. I can't comment on the geothermal. I mean, we're investing a huge amount of money in heat pump technology. 2 weeks ago, we launched a new heat pump. And I think, like a lot of other technologies, there was room for improvement, and I think we will continue to see higher and higher temperature heat pumps that then require less and less in the way of insulation and thermal efficiency in the home. Equally, as you think about each component in the heat pump, as we have, and you look for ways to keep down the cost of each component in the heat pump, as we have, then the cost of the heat pump comes down, and that cost falls even further when you start to roll out at scale. And, we've rightly been some questions asked about the policy environment here in the UK, but, we saw our waiting list for heat pumps soar last week on the back of Rishi Sunak's announcement that he wasn't going to ban gas boilers, because in the same breath he said he was going to increase the subsidy for early adopters from 5,000 to 7,500. So not surprisingly, you got a lot of people now saying, yes, I want a heat pump, who didn't want one before. I mean, of course it's not costless, but most of us probably in our lifetime have replaced 1 or 2 gas boilers, and that isn't costless either. So I think the kind of natural point at which one would be putting a heat pump in, one would be investing either in a new boiler, or if you're building a new house or renovating a house, you would be making that investment anyway. And our goal, which we are very close to achieving, is to get a heat pump to the cost parity with a gas boiler all in. And again, picking up on the same theme, we know we're not the only ones innovating to achieve that goal, because the future of low carbon heating the most efficient form by far is electric. It's 6 times more efficient than, or 3 times more efficient than gas heating, 6 times more efficient than hydrogen heating. I don't know what the stats are for anaerobic digestion, green gas, but it's multiple times. So the logical thing is, as far as you can, build heat pumps to suit every form of accommodation. We might not get there 100%, but we've got a long way to go, and a lot of homes right now that are suitable for heat pumps that don't yet have one.
Great. So I'm afraid we're out of time for any more questions, so sorry to those of you that I didn't quite get to there. For me, just to close on a couple of key takeaways. So for me, it's around the notion of the fossil fuel security, and ultimately we will have a geopolitical shift and new geopolitical challenges, particularly around critical minerals. That's something, unfortunately, we didn't get too much time to dive into, and the geopolitical aspect there, but clearly there will be a shift, and how the world changes over the next couple of decades, I think, will be really interesting to see, ultimately. The tech is there, but we need to cut some of those barriers to implementation, particularly in terms of regulatory environment. And then finally, we also heard heat is a key area for decarbonisation, and I couldn't agree more. We talk a lot about electricity, and electric vehicles are clearly critical to displacing oil. But heat is a key area on a gas. CCS needs careful scrutiny. And then finally, we need markets, and we need clear to improve, and we need clear price signals, not least to consumers, but also to industrial consumers as well, for what end to switch. So thank you for joining us for this session. It leaves me just to thank our 3 speakers, Stephen, Rachel, and Esin. So please join me in thanking the panel.